Eleanor Beck sat propped up in her recliner near the French windows. A woman molded by nearly 9 decades of time, reduced now to silence. Her eyes, once commanding and vibrant, were dulled by age, but not extinguished. After her stroke, her body failed her, one side paralyzed. Her mouth unable to form words, but her mind, tucked away in its stubborn fortress, remained intact. No one asked, no one suspected, they simply assumed. To her daughter-in-law Laura, Eleanor was nothing more than an inert presence, something to be fed, repositioned, and ignored. The way Laura glanced at her, dismissive, detached, was as if Eleanor were no longer human, just another antique in the mansion that collected dust and sentiment. Every morning, Laura would wheel Eleanor to the window, let the light pour onto her faded nightgown, and leave her there like a forgotten painting. Eleanor blinked. It was the only thing she could still do without strain, and she did it often. Not in patterns, not for communication, no one would have noticed if she had. But she blinked to herself, to remember she still could, and to mark time, because in that silence, time was all she had. Time, and a front row seat. Jacob, her son, was a busy man, a builder of empires, he liked to call himself. But the truth was simpler. He was old, tired, and infatuated with his second wife. Laura was 35, with cascading brunette hair, a waist made for silk, and a smile that could delay a man's judgment. She had been charming during the courtship, doting after the wedding, and performatively kind to Eleanor when Jacob was present. But when he left on business, always some conference in Dubai, a negotiation in Munich, Laura became herself again. Felix entered the picture like a summer breeze, young, sun-kissed, and muscular in the way that made Laura tilt her head when he walked by. Officially, he was the gardener. Unofficially, he was Laura's daily distraction. She called him in around teatime, though no tea was ever served. The front door would creak at 4, and by 4:15, they'd be in the sitting room, just a few steps from Eleanor's chair. Eleanor sat, her breathing shallow, her eyes half-lidded. She saw Laura's hands slide under Felix's shirt, heard the whispering, the giggles, the occasional gasp muffled by velvet cushions. Laura rarely even turned Eleanor's chair away. What was the point? The old woman couldn't move, couldn't tell, couldn't do anything, except blink. Sometimes, in the deepest shadows of twilight, the housemaid, young Anya, would walk in and catch Eleanor's gaze pointed not at the garden, but straight at the couch. Anya would freeze, heart thudding, a chill of recognition slipping down her spine. But she said nothing. Perhaps she feared the consequences. Perhaps she told herself it was a trick of light. But Eleanor knew. Every clumsy kiss, every breathless embrace, it all unfolded before her like a cruel stage play performed in the theater of her forced stillness. Then one night, it escalated. The house was silent. Jacob was in Tokyo. The hallway was dark except for a sliver of moonlight crawling across the hardwood floors. Eleanor lay half covered in her blanket, still as always. Laura and Felix didn't whisper this time. They didn't sneak. They made love on the couch, loud and messy, just 10 feet from the woman they believed to be comatose. And that was the night Eleanor blinked, once. Then again, eyes wide open. Her pulse didn't change. Her breath remained calm, but a sharpness returned to her gaze. Something old and buried. She had waited long enough. Because there was something else in that room. Something Laura and Felix had forgotten. The silk pillow beneath Eleanor's fragile head. Inside it, stitched with care by a loyal friend from the past, long dead, long forgotten, was a tiny recording device. Voice-activated, nearly invisible, and it had been listening. From the very first whisper to the very last lie. And Eleanor, she was never asleep, she was never absent, she was the woman in the corner who blinked, and never missed a thing. When Eleanor passed away, the house grew quieter, but not in the way one might expect. Her death was not a dramatic affair. There were no final words, no tearful goodbyes, no dramatic gasps for forgiveness. It was a soft departure, a second stroke that came in the middle of the night. barely waking the nurse who checked on her every 3 hours. She was 92, her skin like delicate parchment, her breathing already slow and fragile in the weeks leading up to it. When the doctor confirmed her passing, the staff and family simply nodded. They had seen it coming. The funeral was private and understated. A few old acquaintances came out of respect, but most of her world had already passed on before her. Laura wore black, dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and stood by Jacob's side with a solemn grace that many thought was noble. But to those who paid closer attention, if anyone had dared to, it was clear her sorrow was rehearsed. There was a barely concealed lightness to her posture, a release that fluttered through her gestures like a woman who had just been unchained. Jacob, for his part, was grief-stricken in a quiet, inward way. He had always been a man of order, not drama. His mother had raised him that way. He gave a short eulogy at the church, simple, heartfelt, a man trying to keep his heart from cracking open. He did not know yet that everything he thought he had buried with his mother was, in fact, about to rise from the grave. 1 week after the funeral, as rain streaked the tall windows of the Beckford estate, Jacob received a call from the family lawyer, Mr. Remington. He was an old man with a hunched back and a voice like gravel. But he carried with him the weight of every truth that families like the Beckfords tried to bury. He asked for a private meeting, per Eleanor's wishes. He had said, when he arrived, he brought with him a sealed envelope and a small, ordinary-looking USB drive. They sat in Jacob's study, mahogany panels, shelves lined with unread first editions. The air scented faintly with old pipe smoke, and Jacob opened the envelope. Inside was a note, written in Eleanor's hand, still sharp and elegant. If you are seeing this, it means I am gone. But I was never absent. The truth is heavier than silence. Listen. Jacob looked up at Mr. Remington, who nodded. With slightly trembling hands, Jacob inserted the USB into his laptop and opened the file. He expected a message, perhaps a loving goodbye, perhaps some cryptic remark about how to live well or forgive easily. What he got instead was a recording. The sound was unmistakable. At first, there was just the ambient hum of the living room, the creak of a sofa cushion, the rustle of fabric. Then came the voices. Laura's voice, high, teasing, breathy. Felix's voice, younger, cockier, a man who thought the walls could not hear him. They laughed, whispered, moaned. They used each other's names. They described what they were doing in detail that made Jacob's stomach turn. The timestamp was from a night Jacob remembered clearly. He had been in Boston for a business meeting. He recalled Laura saying she had spent the evening reading by the fire. And yet, here was her voice, just feet away from Eleanor's bed. Not reading, not mourning, but reveling in betrayal. More recordings followed, each one a different day, different sounds. Sometimes the soft rustle of sheets. Other times, the unmistakable rhythm of bodies colliding. Always with Eleanor present, and always with the same dismissive cruelty. She's just a corpse with a pulse. Laura laughed in one recording. I could dance naked and she wouldn't blink. But the recordings told a different story. There were moments, faint but there, where Eleanor's breathing changed. A subtle hitch, a long pause, once, even, a quiet gasp, and at the very end of the final file, a new voice entered the recording. It was raspy, fragile, but steady. Jacob, Eleanor said, don't let that woman take another inch. Not another inch. It was the first time Jacob had heard her speak in almost a year. He froze. Mr. Remington, quiet beside him, finally spoke. She had that microphone sewn into her pillow. Sir, special order, months ago. Jacob closed the laptop. He did not weep. He did not scream. He stood up slowly, placed the USB back into the envelope, and looked out the window toward the garden where Laura liked to spend her afternoons. There was a stillness to him now, a terrifying, focused stillness. Thank you, Mr. Remington, he said, voice low. Let's begin the paperwork. She won't keep a single cent. And so, with the quiet rage of a man whose last illusion had just shattered, Jacob Beckford prepared for war, with a ghost at his back. And the truth in his hands. Laura slammed her hand down on the kitchen counter, sending a porcelain mug clattering to the floor. This is fake. It has to be. But Jacob didn't even flinch. He sat at the head of the dining table, the USB drive resting before him like a judge's gavel. His face was unreadable, his eyes hollowed out not by anger, but by something colder, resolve. The audio was verified this morning, he said flatly, by 2 forensic specialists, time-stamped, unaltered, and it goes back months. Laura. Months. Laura's lawyer, a smooth-faced man in an ill-fitting suit, tried to regain control. We dispute the credibility of the recording. Mrs. Beckford was not of sound mind. And if this was indeed placed in a personal item, there are issues of privacy. Your client, Jacob interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, had sex with another man on a couch 3 feet from my dying mother. She mocked her, laughed at her, and the only person with decency in that room was unconscious. The silence that followed was not one of defeat, but of growing dread. Laura had always considered herself a survivor, a strategist. She had married an older man for stability, calculated her every move in the social circuit, climbed the ladder with the precision of someone who knew exactly how far charm could take her. But she had never imagined this. She thought Eleanor was just an obstacle, a piece of fading flesh tucked into a corner. She never expected that the old woman's pillow had been listening, that the frail body had carried enough wit, enough fire, to record everything she couldn't speak. Jacob filed for divorce that afternoon. The grounds were clear: infidelity, emotional cruelty, and moral abandonment. But it wasn't just about dissolving a marriage. It was about reclaiming dignity, about honoring a mother whose final act was one of defiant truth. The estate's legal team moved fast. They petitioned to revoke Laura's ownership of shared assets, including the Beckford home, which she had decorated with such pride. They moved to strip her of stock shares Jacob had gifted during their 2nd anniversary. Even her name was to be removed from the foundation she had once posed beside for glossy charity magazine covers. Laura's legal team attempted a weak defense. Eleanor was not mentally sound. She had suffered 2 strokes. How could any evidence collected by her be credible? But the medical records were damning. Nurses had written detailed logs about Eleanor's lucid moments, about how she blinked in response to questions, how she would squeeze hands with subtle strength. And then there was the custom invoice, proof of a specialty microphone sewn into her orthopedic pillow. Ordered months prior, paid for in cash. It was clear Eleanor had planned this. Then came the media. Somehow, as it always does, the story leaked. The pillow confession. Headlines screamed. Daytime talk shows ran dramatic reenactments. Podcasts dissected the ethics of spy recording within households. TikTok exploded with audio remixes of Laura's moans and the parrot-like repetition of her betrayal. It became internet spectacle, tragedy dressed as comedy. A short audio clip from the USB surfaced online. She's just a corpse with a pulse. Laura's voice sneered. It was retweeted over 1 million times. Her name trended for 3 days straight. Endorsement deals she had with lifestyle brands vanished overnight. Her PR agency dropped her. Felix, the once adoring lover, fled. Word spread he had gone back to a small town in the south. Deleted all social accounts. Disappeared like a shadow at noon. In the courtroom, Jacob remained silent. He wore a dark suit, no tie. He brought the pillow, not as a prop, but as a symbol. It sat beside him during the hearings. The judge took note. When the verdict was read, it came with stunning clarity. The recordings were deemed admissible. They were made on private property, inside a privately owned home, on a device belonging to the decedent. Laura had no expectation of privacy in that living room. The evidence stood. The court ruled in favor of Jacob. Laura was ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours. No compensation, no alimony, no stake in the business. She walked out with a suitcase and a pair of sunglasses that could no longer shield her from the public eye. As she stepped into the waiting car, Reporters swarmed, microphones pushed forward. One asked, cruelly, "Do you have anything to say to Mrs. Beckford?" Laura didn't answer, for the first time in years. She understood what silence meant. Not absence, but judgment. Jacob, meanwhile, returned to the estate. He stood in the hallway where so much had unfolded, placed the pillow gently on his mother's empty bed, and whispered, "Thank you." Justice had not come with noise. It had come with a whisper. From the dead. After the verdict was delivered and Laura walked out of the courtroom stripped of everything she had once called hers, the Beckford estate became an entirely different place. It no longer buzzed with soft laughter, footsteps echoing down polished halls, or the scent of expensive candles Laura used to favor. Now, it echoed only with silence, one thick and patient, like fog settling in a valley. Laura left without a final word. There were no dramatics, no pleas for forgiveness, no performance of sorrow. She stepped into the waiting car under the gaze of a few curious neighbors and a scattering of local press. Lips tight, sunglasses covering whatever emotion, if any, flickered in her eyes. Her departure wasn't just from the estate. It was from the story, from the world she had once curated so carefully. Like a fallen actress exiting the final act, she vanished behind the curtain of disgrace. Jacob remained. He did not remarry. He did not sell the house. Instead, he chose to dwell in its emptied corridors, each room a chamber of echoing memory. The estate felt like a mausoleum now, a grand tomb built not just for Eleanor, but for everything Jacob had once believed about love, loyalty, and legacy. The house had once been alive with routines and rituals, shared breakfasts, gentle touch, unspoken gestures. Now, it had become a space that listened more than it spoke. He never touched Eleanor's room. The same floral drapes Laura had once called old-fashioned, still hung beside the wide window. The same pillow, now legendary, still lay on the bed, a permanent fixture, never fluffed, never moved. Every morning, Jacob would enter that room, sit by her bedside, and stay in silence for several minutes. No one knew exactly what he did there, or what he might have been listening for, but in his stillness, there was purpose. Eleanor's voice had not truly left. It lingered, not just in memory, but in sound. The new housekeeper, a quiet woman named Marla, once whispered to the gardener that, some nights, a soft sound would emerge from the old intercom Eleanor had installed years ago. Not music, not static, a phrase, carried like breath through vents and wires. It was always the same. Jacob, don't let that woman take another inch. At first, Marla thought it a malfunction, a looped recording, but the voice felt timed, deliberate, as though it spoke only when the house had fallen entirely still. As if the house, somehow, remembered. The phrase became more than a haunting. It became a kind of mantra. It was printed on bumper stickers, shared in memes, whispered in advocacy circles, for women silenced in their later years, for the elderly ignored in their own homes. Eleanor became a symbol of defiant remembrance. The Internet, so often a vessel of mockery, treated her with reverence. Jacob founded a small but passionate organization, the Silent Witness Fund. Its mission was to empower elderly women, especially those without family, to legally protect their assets, ensure proper representation, and document their voices. Even when the world stopped listening, he poured resources into the cause, declining all interviews but quietly funding scholarships, legal aid clinics, and support centers. He never used Eleanor's story to promote the fund. But everyone knew, everyone understood. The media didn't forget. One headline from a national publication captured the sensation: she never spoke in life, but she screamed in death. A week after the story went viral, a film production company acquired the rights. They announced a miniseries to be titled, The Pillow That Testified. Writers speculated, actresses auditioned, but none of them could quite capture Eleanor's silence, the depth of it, the density, and in the heart of it all, in a glass case set within a quiet alcove of the estate, rested the pillow. It was untouched, protected behind thick glass, and displayed without drama. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "Property of Eleanor Beckford. Witness to truth." It was the only thing Laura had not tried to take, the only thing she had no right to claim. And now, it belonged not just to Jacob, or to the house. It belonged to history, to every woman who was ever unheard, to every voice that had waited patiently for its moment to rise from silence and speak the unshakable truth. 1 year had passed since Eleanor Beckford's voice, carried through a pillow, shifted the course of lives. Jacob, now gray not only in hair but in soul, quietly stepped away from the public eye. He sold off minor properties, cut ties with corporate boards, and left the towering Beckford estate behind. In its place, he chose solitude, a small lakeside home tucked beneath maple trees that blushed red in autumn and whispered secrets to the wind. He brought with him very little: a battered leather chair, a ceramic mug that had once been Eleanor's, and the infamous pillow, its case freshly laundered but still infused with the invisible weight of what it had once heard. It sat on the same chair Eleanor had once watched birds from. Now placed beside the living room window, Jacob never touched it except to dust it, and even then, with reverence. In the silence of that lakeside home, Jacob began to write. It started as a way to process the unbearable quiet. But soon, words found rhythm, and rhythm gave birth to chapters. The book he completed 6 months later was titled, The Quiet Betrayal, A Husband, a Pillow, and a Truth No One Heard. To everyone's surprise, including Jacob's, the book became a bestseller. It resonated not as scandal, but as scripture. The prose was restrained, gentle, never accusatory. Jacob wrote not to destroy Laura, but to remember Eleanor. The world, it seemed, had grown hungry for stories where justice came not with shouting, but with stillness. Critics described it as painfully elegant, and a meditation on how silence can roar louder than rage. Letters poured in, not emails, real letters. Handwritten, tear-stained, sent from retirement homes and hospital beds. From women who had long since given up being listened to. They thanked him, not for the drama, but for giving voice to a generation that had been made invisible. One woman wrote, "I used to talk to my sewing machine. Now I talk to my lawyer. Thank your mother." Jacob read every single one. Meanwhile, Laura had disappeared, not in the criminal sense. There had been no formal charges. But she vanished from tabloids and search engines alike. Rumor had it she worked at a sleepy cafe in New Hampshire. Her blonde hair dyed dark, her lips rarely painted. Someone posted a blurry photo once, a woman, head bowed, wiping tables while a French song played softly in the background. The same song she had once danced to in the living room with Felix. She didn't give interviews, didn't write tell-alls. If anything, her punishment was silence, not imposed, but inherited, the kind that grows from seeds of betrayal, watered daily by regret. Jacob never mentioned her again. He had stopped keeping track of her long ago. Instead, he poured his attention into the lavender bushes outside his window, pruning them just as Eleanor once had. He donated anonymously to elderly advocacy groups. And each year, on Eleanor's birthday, he placed the pillow on the deck chair, opened a worn audio file, and sat in quiet vigil. Once, his granddaughter, 10 and inquisitive, asked about the pillow. Did great-grandma really say that? Just once. Jacob looked at her. Once is all it takes. He said, if it's the truth. And the truth did remain. In the pillow, in the book, in the legacy of a whisper that refused to die quietly. The story closed, not with a bang, but a breath. And yet, that breath stirred winds in homes, in courtrooms, in hearts that had waited too long to be heard. Not every weapon is loud. Some are stitched with feathers. Even the voiceless leave echoes. Especially when the truth matters enough.